Hi, this is Ron Vellon, and welcome to this video tutorial, part 2 of Leading and Managing Change. Here in part 2, we shift our focus of the managing change discussion to kind of the lay of the land, so the people that we would be working with and how ready they are, who the stakeholders are in the organization and how involved they need to be. This is important to understand because we need to locate the people who have an interest in the project you're working on, people who are impacted by the project you are leading, as well as the people who have both formal and informal power within the organization that can have an impact on the resources you get, the people that they assign to your project, or how they support it. All of these things need to be mapped out so you know who you need to talk to and how things are going to get managed on many levels. We need to look at the forces that are supporting the change and the forces that are working against it, or the forces that are supporting the status quo. And we're also going to look at a quick picture of organization development and how that fits into the larger picture of leading change in an organization. So let's begin with the discussion of readiness for change. At the very beginning of a change initiative, and I would argue even before the change even gets started, we need to ask some questions of the area that will be impacted the organization, if not the whole organization itself, to understand how receptive the organization is to the change effort we're providing and how ready they are to work it into their systems, to work it into their work environment and what they're doing currently. I'm going to review a handful of questions here that are always good to explore. And this is not just with the people immediately involved with the project, but with all stakeholders. And we're going to look at a stakeholder map a little bit later, including and especially the people who are directly impacted by whatever it is we want to implement. So the first question to look at is there pressure for the change? And this really goes back to something we talked about in the first module. Is there an urgency? And urgency or pressure, whatever the pressure is coming from, whether it's internal from senior management or other things, or external having to do the work environment we're in, whatever it is, we need to understand that this is needed now, because we then need to explain it to the people we are working with that this is something that the timing of it is now. Is there a shared vision of the goals, benefits, and direction? Often there isn't. And so part of the groundwork is talking to people, researching either qualitatively or quantitatively through interviews or surveys, whatever it takes to understand what people think the vision is of the organization and how the change effort fits into the goals and what the benefits are of the change and how it fits into the direction of the organization or department or team or whatever you're actually working with. Do we have a collective liaison on trust between those concerned? In other words, is there a working thread and connection between those that are involved and impacted by the change? And if not, this has to be built. And often this is the case. We typically have to build this up in some way through relationship, through collaborations, and input on the project, and so forth. It's really important that that be looked at and integrated into the change management process. Is there will and power to act? What this means is there a willingness to support and act? And this willingness comes from different parts of the organization that are impacted by or are guiding the change initiative, from leadership to frontline employees. That will has to be there. It's a hard one to determine. And sometimes we think we understand that there is will, but that's not necessarily consistent. And the second one about power to act has a lot to do with, the authority you will have with the project. And if you don't have the formal authority, do you have the right stakeholders involved and the right decision makers involved so that you can actually follow through? Otherwise, you're going to hit a brick wall. Next is, do we have enough capable people with sufficient resources? So even though it's treated as a separate item, The homework and groundwork you do in the other elements around readiness will probably help you answer this question fairly easily. Do we have suitable rewards and defined accountability? So this comes into play heavily with the planning and execution of your project plan. So making sure that people are seeing this as something as a priority, and that the systems that support the people doing the work, the reward systems and everything else that around it, are lending themselves to the fulfillment of the change initiative. Have we identified actionable first steps? Really great if you can get into small wins and victories initially. In other words, where do we need to start right away? What are our first steps? And they don't need to be big steps. Typically, I find getting things moving with small accountabilities and things we can execute right away help get things going. And the last one is, and this is a bigger question, does the organization have a capacity to learn and to adapt? You may be creating a change initiative in an environment where you're breaking new ground. Maybe this is not something that your organization or the area that's affected is used to. But it's an important question to ask is, do we have the capacity to learn and to adapt it? My answer always is yes, we do have the capacity, but do other people see it that way? So this might take some work to sort out, and a lot of it requires dialogue, some research, and start to shift people's perspective, and you may find that they're often more open than they let people know initially. Step by step, answer a lot of these questions along with the other work we've talked about in Module 1, and you'll find that bit by bit you can open things up typically. And it just might not be on your agenda. It might take more time and more patience and more energy than you originally thought. The next thing we're going to look at now is something called a stakeholder analysis. This is a great simple tool, and we're going to go through it briefly, but it really helps us to understand who needs to be involved, who is interested, who's impacted, and what level of involvement and communication do we need to utilize to connect with those different folks. So as we see, this is a 4-quadrant framework, and in the world of leading change and organization development, we have a lot of models with quadrants and pie charts and things like this. So it's just a simple way to get a snapshot of what we need to consider when we're leading a change effort. One axis talks about level of interest, and this may or may not have anything to do with the official title someone has or their position in the organization. It may have something to do with someone's overall interest of the well-being of an area you're working in, or the employees directly impacted by it. It can have a lot of different variation depending on which group we're talking about. The other thing we need to look at is power. This is formal and informal, and the scale is simply, low power versus high power. So when these two things come together, we begin to look at the intersection between the power someone has within the organization and their interest. So let's quickly touch on each of these quadrants and what they basically mean. The first one is looking at someone who has low power in the organization. Maybe they're a frontline supervisor, or they're a frontline employee, or they're a manager in a different area. And this is in the context, by the way, we have to keep this in mind. This is in the context of the change effort. In other words, you don't have to look at the entire organization unless it's involved and connected to the change project you're doing directly. So think of it in terms of the change you're planning and the world it is moving through. Who are the people here? So somebody with low power in the organization and a low level of interest, there's not much effort you need to make in terms of their engagement and communication and having open dialogue necessarily. However, it's always good to keep these folks in mind because there are ripple effects in an organization, but this just tells you, okay, this is a second or third or fourth level of effort we need to make here. We need to focus our energy on the high priorities. Let's move over. So let's say somebody has low power but a high interest in the work you're doing. This person B, they have a lot of interest. Maybe they are someone who is going to be directly impacted, but they're not decision makers. Maybe they are someone who is looking at your work. Maybe it's a mentor who doesn't make decisions for you in your career, but they have an interest in the work you're doing and can possibly connect you with other people in the organization for future work. Members of a union or leaders of a union. And so they have, let's say, low power over what is actually going on in the specific area, but they're very interested because maybe they see it as potential impact for other union members and so on. Another group where they have high power but a low level of interest, these are the ones we have to keep them happy. In other words, they can often be much more senior in the organization, but maybe you're working on a project with a couple of teams or a department. So very important that they're kept informed on a big picture level and that they're happy with the high level view of where you're going and what the opportunity is to benefit their organization. But they're not going to be involved in day-to-day decision making. They're going to delegate that probably to the next quadrant we're going to talk about in a moment. So important to understand and identify who those people are. And the last group, the most impactful group and the most probably vital group to your project, are the ones with high power and high interest. These are your key players. These may be part of a steering committee you create. They may be part of some kind of a coalition across different areas in the organization that are supporting the change effort. Maybe, as we mentioned earlier, the union is a little bit more involved. Maybe it directly impacts the union relationship with the organization and their organization members. Maybe it's the department heads, team leaders, customers. It could be anyone that you see who has some level of authority, and certainly a customer can have some authority even though it's not directly within the organization. They carry a lot of power because of their influence, their buying power. So this is the critical one that you should spend a lot of time on and understanding who those key players are. Do not make the mistake of avoiding the other three quadrants. Here's a very simple example. Let's say you're working with someone who is a division head and they have several people reporting to them. The division head really has a lot of interest in this project. They have a lot of power, so they fall into category D. And you may look at the people reporting to them as, well, they're not that important. They may not have much interest. Maybe they've been told to have interest, but they don't have any power. And you see them in Group A and you think, well, we're not going to bother with them too much. That's a mistake. One of the reasons is because this group of people may be moving around the organization. They may get promoted one day and they're going to remember how you treated them. So again, it doesn't mean you need to move them into a different category if they fall into category A. But whatever minimal effort you make sure you do it. So if it's simple communication, an update to their area, whatever it is, maybe invite them to a meeting once in a while. And even if they don't go, at least they've been invited. Make sure you're consistent with it and don't forget about the people on the periphery. You may find that they'll emerge as a supporter of changes down the road because they saw that you treated them with sincerity and respect. So that's a stakeholder analysis. One way I find effective, instead of making long lists on a piece of paper, what I'll do is I'll use the quadrants and expand it and create a graphic or a map, and then put various people into each of those quadrants. And sometimes you might find at different times people will fall into one quadrant for a while and they might shift over. Maybe somebody's in a high interest level, let's say in category B, and then after a while they kind of fade into the background into Group A. Either way, when you create a map of it, it becomes much easier to track the stakeholders that you really need to pay attention to and ensure that everyone involved directly and indirectly and impacted directly and indirectly are connected to and connected with throughout the arc of the change management initiative. And now the last model we're going to discuss is something called force field analysis. This is a really helpful tool that allows us to see what forces are present that are supporting the change or prompting the change, and also to understand which forces are seeking to maintain the status quo, or what we might call forces against the change. Although this is a fairly simple diagram, the middle column here, in which case we see here something called the proposed change, we can actually use this force field analysis in two ways. So we can look at the change initiative itself and put that in the diagram and say, okay, what's supporting it? And we're going to look at a couple of different examples in a moment. Or we can use the same model to look at the current state of our circumstance before we launch the change. I won't go into a lot of that in detail now because we're focusing primarily on the forces for and against a proposed change initiative. But you can actually use this to look at, let's say, the current state of your department. So what this can look like is if you are a leader of a department or a division or even a team, you can actually use this same model to take a snapshot of how and why your team is or department or division are performing the way they are. So you can look at and say, what are the forces that are driving us forward? And again, we look at the left-hand column. And so instead of the forces for change, we might call it the forces for progress or the forces for performance. And in the left-hand column, you can look and say, what are some of the resistant forces? Just to get a sense of where you are in the status quo. And in a few minutes, we're going to look at how this shows up for a team potentially needing change. So let's first look at an example of how this is applied to a change project. So here we have an example of a factory needing some upgraded manufacturing equipment. So that's this here, right in the middle. That's the change initiative or the change project. And if we zoom in a little further, just going to zoom in here, we can see some of the forces. Customers want new products. Now, why is that a force? It's a force because that is one of the pressures put on the organization to deliver a certain kind of product or output. And that awareness goes through the organization and says, in order to be able to do this, what we need to do is upgrade our factory equipment so that we can produce better quality or more innovative products. Another force, because of whatever pressure in the external environment or maybe just an internal need for change, you're going to see that there's improved production speed. So this is something that is also a pressure and is a force for change. Now, what these arrows represent by their different size is their relative importance or influence. So this one, and you can use any scale, you don't need to use a numbered scale, but it's sometimes useful. You can see that the customers wanting new products is a big one. So we see that as a number one priority. Another priority, not as big though, is the improved production speed. This has to do with efficiency. That may have come up in conversation saying, well, if we want to get new products out there, maybe we need to be faster in how we produce them so that we can turn things over more quickly or something along those lines. Another potential force or another force for change is reduced training time. Maybe there's a recognized need to speed up the ongoing training needed for employees in order to support the other two forces in being fulfilled. So perhaps training is taking a long time, and one of the reasons training is taking a long time is because we don't have the support for it, we don't have the budget for it perhaps. We might not have the ability to respond to new technical improvements because the training is so slow. As you can see, that's a mid-level force. It's in position 3. And then we have one more, which is about reducing maintenance costs. So again, this is about improving the financial efficacy of this particular part of the organization from the maintenance side. So you have some potential here to improve revenue and reduce cost, improve efficiency. These are all powerful forces that support the opportunity to fulfill the change initiative of upgrading the factory with new manufacturing equipment. Looking at the other side, we see that we have some forces against change. So these are the forces that we see as resistors or negative impacts on the potential change. The first one, we talk about loss of staff overtime. Now, from a company point of view, they see the loss of staff over time as a cost saving. From an employee point of view, they see it as a lost opportunity to make some extra money, which is a very common situation when you have manufacturing plants and other areas where there's overtime paid. So that force against the change, what it means is it's not that the loss of staff overtime itself is the force, but how people feel about that loss. In other words, it's the loss on behalf of the employees, that the employees will therefore resist the change. Staff being fearful of new technology. So again, we have here a fear on behalf of the employees. And that fear will get expressed through various things, through various forms of resistance. Maybe complaining, not following through, dragging their heels, and all these other things. So that's another significant force. Impact on the environment. Will there be created some environmental negative impacts with the upgraded factory equipment? Will there be things that we throw out or have to discard, and that puts things in a landfill? So that's a negative force, and depending on how the organization or the employees feel about this, that's going to be another one. The cost, the sheer cost of doing the upgrade, and it's likely other people in leadership roles in the organization who are responsible for these costs, this has to be addressed. Things cost money, but if the things that cost money result in a bigger financial gain, then of course it's an investment in something wonderful. But that cost has to be addressed in some way, and it's not the cost itself again. It's about leadership or other managers or employees saying, how are we going to deal with this? And then of course there's another one, which is simply the disruption of the organization. So this is related to downtime, perhaps the time it takes to pull out the old equipment and put in the new equipment and train everybody. There's going to be downtime, and that does equal lost revenue while you can't produce product. And in the short term, there's going to be increase in cost. So these are all the forces in this particular case that are identified. And this idea of upgrading the factory with new manufacturing equipment is the change initiative. And then you have the forces for change. In other words, what's making the case for it and what's the case against it. And you'll find that not everything is logical. Sometimes things are emotional or people have questions. And if you go back to Module 1, if you take a look at Cotter's change model and some of the other things we've talked about, you see that when you're mapping out a change initiative, this is an important step to understand what do we need to do to make sure this change is successful. Well, these forces need to be addressed. The forces for change need to be crystal clear and easy to communicate to everybody so that everyone understands. And the forces against change need to be addressed in a way that's not just shutting people down or just giving quick answers. People need to be heard on these things. So we need to listen before responding. And you'll notice that as people feel heard, they're going to start feeling included, and you're going to find that they're going to become more engaged, which again is a principal idea in leading change effectively. One last thing here about forces. Forces for change or the status quo are not equal to benefits. Sometimes they seem like they are, and they may be, but forces are pressures. Benefits will address those pressures. So for example, if we look at improved production speed, that is a benefit, but the need is the force. So don't substitute benefits for forces, even though they may sound similar at different times. Let's take a look now at one more example. And this last example is for a team. And this is going back to the idea that we can use the force field analysis tool to actually look at current state of a situation. So in this one, we have the current performance of the team, whatever it might be. And it could be evaluated in terms of its output, productivity, creativity, whatever it might be. The current performance is here. Now, what's desired is increased performance here. So this is kind of the goal. We want our team to be improved so that we perform at an optimal level, let's say. Well, you definitely need to define what that is, and you need to do it clearly. And once you know what that is, you go back and say, okay, our current performance is X, and what's putting pressure on X to go to Y, this is not a math equation, but I'm just going to use X and Y, where X is the current performance. The new technology coming into the system, or desperately needed by the system, is a force pushing current performance to the desired performance. Whatever the team function is, access to better raw materials, that's putting pressure on current performance to move toward the next level. Competition from other groups, these could be within the organization or department itself. So if there's good, healthy competition, or even unhealthy competition, that's going to put pressure on the current performance of the team to move toward that next level. And then you also have supervisor pressures. So these are team leaders or team leader bosses and so on, saying, we need to be better across the board. We need to improve our culture. We need to do X or Y or Z, whatever our outcomes are. Or we need to do A, B, C, whatever outcomes we're looking for. And that supervisor pressure also wants to see the team reach that next level. So what would normally resist this? This seems to be all good. So why would there be resistances, and what could they possibly look like? Just going to erase some of this here. We're going to work this backwards. So what is resisting the movement toward the desired performance? Well, we have group performance norms. These are ingrained norms of behavior. In other words, what do we accept as being normal and expected behavior and attitude and so on within the group or the team? And as we'll find out in other modules and discussions, norms are very powerful. So if there's certain ways of doing things and there's a potential for this to be disrupted, this is something that's going to definitely provide resistance. Good old fear of change is another one. And that varies from person to person. It depends on the environment and the history of making changes in the organization and potential job security. And who knows, there are myriad things that can influence someone's fear of change. So that's going to come up. Member complacency. This one is harder to get really clear on. This is going to come across as apathy, perhaps, or lack of energy or enthusiasm. It may also be showing up in group performance norms. But member complacency, it's simply not interested. Maybe they don't have a lot of faith in what's being asked of them. Maybe there's a history of change efforts like these just going awry and not getting anywhere. Maybe the employees don't feel valued. There could be so many different reasons for it that are worth understanding. And the other one is well-learned skills. Now, what this means in terms of a force against the change or a force for the status quo is when people have a really strong set of skills that they've really learned deeply, and the change will require the letting go of some of those skills and likely learning new ones, it's resisted because we become identified with these skills. There are very powerful connections and attachments we have to our well-learned skills, and we don't want to let them go. And there are many examples we could dig out, but this gives you a sense of what some of the forces would be. And from kind of a team generic performance point of view, a lot of these forces show up all the time. So the change is not in the middle of this diagram. We're looking at the current performance, but we have a sense of what is creating the current status quo right now. And so if we were to bring in a change, we'd be able to look at some of these things and say, oh, this is why we can't get the change off the ground, even though we're aiming for this wonderful outcome over here. So there you go. We're going to end the force field analysis discussion there, but that gives you a sense of how things get stuck in an organization and what we need to do or address in order to move them forward, whether it's a change initiative that gets stuck or whether it's a team or a department that is stuck. It's the same idea. What are the forces for the change? What are the forces supporting the status quo? So the last thing we're going to have a look at is a quick look at organization development. This is something we get into more deeply later on, but I would like to at least have you look at a snapshot. Organization development is not the same as change management. It is a different set of disciplines, but is, in my opinion, highly complementary to traditional change management. This is one definition. Organization development, or OD, as it is commonly referred to, is the process of planned interventions utilizing behavioral and organizational principles to change a system and improve its effectiveness, conducted in accordance with values of humanism, participation, choice, and development, so that the organization and its members learn and develop. So we see keywords: learning, developing, humanism, participation, choice. And if we look at a foundational roadmap for organization development, we see that we begin with the problem identification. That's here. And we need to really clarify what that is. One of the biggest challenges, and I encourage you to watch the video tutorial called The Underlying Issue, is really taking a look at what is the problem we're trying to really shift or change. So we look at problem identification, and we do a situational assessment, which involves some level of research into the organization, the system, through the cooperation and collaboration of the people there. Once we really identify what the problem is, we begin action planning. And an intervention is something we'll get into when we look more deeply at organization development. But an intervention is a process typically that's very humanistic, that allows the people to go through a series of steps to figure out how to take that issue and make it a much better entity within the organization. So we create some action planning, we implement that plan, we gather data. So what we're looking for is understanding of results. How well did the intervention do? We analyze those results to see how did things go? Did we get the results we were hoping for, or is there more work to do? Rarely do you get a perfect outcome with interventions, regardless of the design and how good it was. But whatever you achieved, you build on. So you analyze the results, you get some feedback from the people that were involved in supporting the intervention that you implemented. You also get feedback from the people around to say, what other things are there that we need to address? Because there's always more to do. So we look at what else do we need to do, and we repeat the process. So from the feedback, we go back and re-clarify whatever the problem has become. So hopefully you've made some progress and you now look for the next thing. And this is a complete cycle that you can repeat over and over again. So that's it for this module. We've taken a look in part 2 here at the readiness for change. How ready is the organization to engage with and receive and implement the change effort that you have in mind? We've taken a look at stakeholder analysis in the 4 quadrants. And we've looked at force field analysis that has 2 applications. One is to look at the forces for or supporting a change initiative, and the forces working against it or supporting the status quo. And we also, in a slightly different view, can see the application of it in looking at the current state of affairs in a particular area or team, which is look at and say, what's keeping us where we are? And how do we get to that next level of performance? Really, it's the same application, just slightly twisted from one to the other, but it's the same basic idea. What are the forces for change, and what are the forces for the status quo? And then finally, we looked at organization development in a very quick snapshot way, and we will get to more of that later on.